Welcome to the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast with Amy Wheeler. We're a global community of yoga therapists and related professionals who are sharing our knowledge and experience with one another to make the world a better place for all of us to thrive. On this podcast, we have deep and thought-provoking conversations that we hope will nourish you and make you feel more connected to yourself and to others. Feel free to continue these conversations on our private Facebook group called Yoga Therapy Hour Podcast with Amy Wheeler, and listen at the end of the podcast each week as we'll be giving away a special gift. Remember, we have a mobile app coming out May 2nd, 2022 that tracks mental health and so much more using the foundations of yoga and Ayurveda. Hello. In this episode, I talked to my friend and colleague, Stephanie Sohl, who is a faculty and researcher at Wake Forest School of Medicine. She's in the Department of Social Sciences and Health Policy, basically what you would call public health. And Stephanie tells you in this episode her journey from just being in college and having some life events happen, and how that led her to get so involved in yoga, as well as becoming a lifelong researcher. And from my perspective, I've worked with many researchers in the field of yoga and yoga therapy as a protocol developer. Most of them are not serious yogis. And so as I'm developing the protocols, I have to spend a lot of time explaining to them why we do this and why we don't do that. And please watch out for this. And it is so much easier to work with a researcher over a decade or more that Stephanie and I have been working together on this, that understands the yoga language, understands the philosophy, the underlying purpose, so that we can have these discussions about how to modify to meet our functional goals, right? Both parties are on the same team. I have been trained as a university professor, getting a Ph.D. I've been trained in how to do research, even though I haven't made that my lifelong career. And Stephanie has been trained in how to do yoga and research. So we come together beautifully along with so many people on the team. One thing that people don't realize about research is that you do have 7 or 8 people on the team. You have the principal investigator, you have the statistician, you have the people helping to do literature reviews that make sure that the actual question you're asking in the study is actually a valid question and is building upon the other research that's already been done out there. We have the protocol developer, which is what I've been doing. I also do fidelity, which means I watch the videotapes of the yoga teachers that she has hired and make sure that they're actually following the protocol and giving appropriate modifications as needed. And so the whole thing, I mean, like I said, we've been working together for a decade, and one study with 40 people can take 4 years of Stephanie working full-time, me working part-time, and then the whole team chipping in. So you can really imagine how challenging this can be. Now, what is the end game here? Stephanie is in basically a Department of Public Health at Wake Forest University, and the goal is that the research she's doing focuses on breast cancer, colorectal cancer, gynecological cancer. The goal is to develop a protocol, a yoga and yoga therapy protocol that addresses mind, body, and spirit and breath that can be distributed to anyone who is getting chemotherapy and or radiation, and can be administered to them during this treatment process, with the caveat that the person teaching it, the yoga teacher or yoga therapist, knows how to modify that protocol for the person in front of them. Right? If someone has some kind of injury, or maybe you try to teach them how to take a long exhale and they can't do it, well, then what do? Maybe you try to get someone to find a place inside of themselves that's full of stillness and quietude, and they bust out in tears and say, I haven't felt still or quiet since this whole thing began. And I'm kind of angry that you're even suggesting that to me right now. Like, you have to be a pretty skilled yoga teacher or yoga therapist to know how to hold that person and be present. So, the end game is to have people teaching yoga in hospitals that can stick with a protocol, but also know how to modify it. And in that way, we can get yoga and yoga therapy for every person in every hospital bed across the entire United States. And as I said, we teach presence as a yoga therapist. How can I be present to you? We teach gentle breathing exercises for relaxation, or sometimes to give people a little bit of energy, depending on which direction we need to take their nervous system. We teach people how to find a quiet place within, possibly, or what some people might call meditation. If the person wanted someone to be there for them for any type of spiritual purposes, we could hold space for that. And something Stephanie said to me off camera that we didn't talk about, but I think it's really important to think about, is that if yoga therapists were in hospitals, they could kind of be the first tier of defense. There's not enough psychologists in hospitals for all the patients, but a yoga therapist could go in and teach breathing exercises, teach relaxation, have a loving, caring, empathetic presence. And then if the yoga therapist felt like, this is out of my scope of practice, this person actually has some mental health issues that need a higher level, they could refer up to a clinical psychologist that would then come. But the yoga therapist could do a whole lot of good. I mean, how many people sitting in the hospital are just completely stressed out and would benefit from relaxation exercises, right? So we can really be there as that first tier of defense, staying within our scope of practice and knowing when to refer out. And later in the interview, I really get into how is this going to help the patients? How is this going to help the staff? How could this potentially cut costs for the hospital? So I hope you enjoy this interview. And I think you're going to learn so much about research and what it takes, and also how yoga and yoga therapy could help change hospitals for the better. Welcome to Stephanie Sohl from Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And Stephanie, you're in the Division of Public Health Sciences. I welcome you. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Amy. I'm honored to be here.
So tell us about yourself. You're a researcher, but you're also a yogi. And I want to hear how those two things came together for you.
Absolutely. So I'll give some highlights and happy to elaborate on anything. So I'd say, one of the decision points that sort of started all this for me was I graduated college and I was deciding which way to go from there. And I had one of my mother's closest friends, who was sort of like an aunt to me, she was very involved in my life, had passed away from colon cancer right around that time period. And this was really important to me for realizing how important health is to life and how critical it is to be healthy, to live a life where you can be engaged and part of it. So that led me to pursue a degree in health psychology rather than some of the other things I was considering. I did a degree in social and health psychology. And what I focused on was how people cope with illnesses and the stress that's related to that. So that was my stress and coping, I'd say, is the big focus of my research in that area. And so after I considered all these different graduate school programs, I landed in Stony Brook University in New York. And that's just an hour and a half down the road from where I grew up. And it was very, it just felt like a very nurturing environment. Then I learned that that's where she had gone to school, this friend of my mom's. And I said, oh, isn't that, so I appreciated that serendipity and felt like I was on the right path for me. In the middle of that degree program, I was often at a desk doing a lot of writing, and I, kind of isolated to get that Ph.D. and started to seek out, well, how can I teach stress and coping to people. I don't feel like I need the clinical psychology degree, which I had considered on and off, because I was more interested in the people that are so clinical psychology often helps people cope with very serious mental health challenges. And I was interested in the stress of like normal daily stresses and how people cope with those, including things that are like cancer diagnosis. And so I found a local yoga instructor that was also a physical therapist, and she was teaching people with cancer. And I said, oh, well, how do I become you? And so I ended up deciding to do a yoga teacher training, and I found one that worked with my already kind of busy schedule from graduate school, and luckily had a very supportive mentor. And turns out after I was really excited about this program, I ended up deciding, well, I could stay with my parents, which was near the program, on weekends and do this. I found out it was my mom's first yoga teacher. So I was thinking, oh, wasn't this neat? Another kind of confirmation or serendipity on this journey. And so I did have a very, I grew up in a home where my parents did some yoga and meditation. And so it was part of my awareness growing up as well. And so then from there, I got my degree, and I decided I still wanted more training specific to working with people with cancer. And so I found this yoga therapy in cancer and chronic illness training, who at the time was taught by Yanni Chapman, and is now taught by Sandra Gilbert. And that training was interesting. I handed in my dissertation to be reviewed. I went to the training, and then I came back and defended it. So it was like right in this kind of crucial time period. And all that to say is meeting people at that training has really supported me, throughout my career. So the instructors I worked with that have been part of that training have taught for my studies, or, kind of mentored me in my yoga world, and you really informed a lot of the interventions, as have you. So I also, through Yanni Chapman, met Suzanne Danhauer, who I came to work with at Wake Forest. And so it's really, just been an important part of my career trajectory to have yoga as part of it. I think another interesting sort of part I didn't mention is, for a while, I did my graduate training in New York, and I also did some time in New York City after that, where I got to do this program where I taught yoga in hospitals. So it was called Urban Zen Integrative Therapy. And I also had a mentor at the time where he was teaching hypnosis around the time of surgery. And so I was talking to patients around that time about, well, how can we teach yoga to you in a way that'll work for you? And these are people that are traveling pretty far, and getting around in New York is pretty challenging. But they were sitting in these chemotherapy chairs for 2 or 3 hours. And I was learning about this training where we could teach in the clinical setting. And so it kind of all came together there too, where another place that we could reach people with yoga was while they were already on site getting cancer treatment. So I'd say it kind of, I've had so much guidance along the way, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share some of that, all these different mentors and people that have helped me on my path.
I've known you for over a decade, and I didn't know some of that about you.
Yeah.
It really is an integration of your personal experience and your academic interests. I mean, it really is this perfect marriage.
Yeah, I feel partially responsible and partially guided to that. Yeah. And, meeting you, as we'll talk about, really helped. Yeah, I think it might be more specific when we get into the research, but has also been very supportive in how to reach people in a way that, you really have this approach of being very pragmatic about, the best yoga we can do is the kind you'll actually do. I feel like
that is my belief.
For me personally, right, I've had practices where I can incorporate into my daily life. And then we've translated that into how we can support patients the best too. So
yeah, let's those kind of details, I'm sure people are going to be so interested in. But let's start off with the kind of description of what does it take to be a yoga therapy researcher? Because I have people email me probably twice a month and say, I'm a 200-hour yoga teacher with no academic training, and I'd like to do a research study. Can you help me? And it's very difficult for me to tell them something to the effect of, we can't take our car when it gets broken to a random person and say, can you fix the car? Like there is a whole series of events that has to occur to become a seasoned mechanic so that you can actually fix the car. And I feel like the same is true for yoga research, that people don't understand the advanced degrees that are required, and then the research internships and the years of small pilot studies to maybe one day get a grant, eventually leading to a randomized control trial. Like, can you just kind of take us through what it takes to be a yoga researcher?
Yeah, sure. So now that you have sort of the detailed story, kind of the timeline of that is, I started my graduate degree in 2003. And I started doing studies in New York City in, 2000, I'd say 8 or 10, that were just me being the yoga teacher, seeing about 7 people and getting some measurements, right? And that then gave me some data to show that, oh, look, I can do this in the clinical setting. We can see like a little change, even though it might be a busy environment. And then that led to like a little bit of a larger study, and then meaning like 14 people. And then that led to a little bit of a larger study, meaning 40. And then, then we submitted grants recently to do larger. And so what ends up happening is there's a couple things. One is you have to convince people it's worth their money to pay you to do this, because you need somebody's time and energy to write the grants and papers. And to convince them to do, so each step along the way, you need to show that it's possible and show that you can recruit people and that they're interested and that they say it's helpful. And so I've spent, I feel like I'm sort of a bridge or a translator between the language that the medical community speaks, meaning like statistics and theoretical models and these kind of things, where you have to explain what we're doing with yoga in the context that is already integrated into clinical care. And so what does this add? How come it's worth it? And to be able to use the sort of terminology that people are already used to. And, I've spent quite a lot of time trying to understand what the yoga terminology is as well, so that I can hopefully be a translator. Yeah.
So it took you 5 or 6 years to get a PhD in the area of research. So that's one thing. And then it's taken you, I don't know, another 15 or so years to kind of start small and eventually move up to the point where you have received some very nice large grants from where? What organizations?
Yeah, so recently, you and I collaborated we've had 2 grants that were they still consider them pilot studies. We've, recruited about 40 people over to the first, they're both from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health from the National Institute of Health. One was a grant that helped also train my career. So more training, right? I've been just training. I love it, actually. It's hard for me to shift from student to expert. I think I'll be a lifelong learner. It's just how my grandparents taught me. So in any event, we did that one grant. It was called a K grant, where I got some training along with the research trajectory for one of our yoga studies in cancer patients. And then our other one was from a mechanism called an R34, which was like a 3-year grant. Yeah.
And these are from the National Institutes of Health, NIH?
Yes.
Did I say that right? Sometimes, is it institute or institutes?
They do say institutes. They have many different institutes.
Okay.
And then we are funded by a center within that. So it's just like this.
But even just writing the proposals, I mean, I get emails from you on a regular basis saying, can we submit you as an advisor for this study? Or we got rejected from this journal. We're going to resubmit it to this journal. Can you please, like it is this ongoing thing. And I just wanted to start with that because I think people don't realize that this is a very, very specialty thing. And that's not to say you can't collect a little data on the people in your classrooms, but it probably, for a variety of reasons, isn't going to get published in a journal unless you're well trained and you have actually done the steps that you've done over the last 2 decades.
Yes, I it's a big learning curve if it's something new. So, I would say the other path could be to partner with a researcher. It's just that, like you said, it's very specialized. So the chances of somebody living near you that has this as a topic area of study is
well, and the researchers are expected
yeah.
to go get grants to fund their own salary. If they don't
Yes.
fund their own salary, then they will not be hired much longer. And so to take up a random project of a local yoga teacher, it's just not realistic. That's not usually in their career path.
Right. So we have to show that when we apply for grants that we are the perfect person to be doing this. We've been doing work in this area for a long time. We're very dedicated to it. So it's hard to just pick up a new project unless it's really serendipitous and aligned in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into this. You and I met in Nashville because you were at Vanderbilt University and I was doing some yoga therapy training there. I think we even met before that, actually. But tell us about your first studies when you first started this kind of train of thought that you were going to study cancer, gynecological, colorectal cancer. Can you tell us a little bit about those first studies and then where it's evolving to now?
Yes, sure. So I started to touch upon that. I was talking to people in the chemotherapy setting about, well, how do we make this something that will work for you? And people were not very interested in coming back for an additional class. And so what we see in the literature on yoga and people with cancer so far is that most of the participants have been people with breast cancer and that are in the group class format, at least in the United States. It's different in India. And so it just seems that the people that are willing to go to these group classes are a very select few. And what we decided to do based on the feedback from participants, and as I mentioned, just kind of the training I was getting at the time, was to teach like a chair seated yoga in the chemotherapy chair during the infusion center during treatment. And so this allowed people to learn yoga or during the time where they were already there and then we could see them. And so what ended up when I met you, Amy, what was really felt like a great fit was that the Krishnamacharya tradition and you specifically really helped teach me that there's ways that we can choose practices that can most support certain desired therapeutic outcomes. And it helped us make it a little bit more efficient potentially, in theory anyway. And so we were able to meet with people. So the classes that were being delivered in these other studies that were found to be helpful for things like fatigue and sleep disturbances or depressive symptoms, those were usually an hour and a half long, right? Or something like that twice a week. But we were able to take a different approach where we taught shorter, simpler classes that we really designed to be able to be practiced at home independently. We would give them materials like recordings to listen to and some of the stick figures that you use in your tradition if once they got the hang of it, they could do it somewhat by memory with those as a prompt. And so really our approach was different where we kept the format simple. I mean, people were so there's difference between being in treatment, which can be more stressful and demanding on their time versus a lot of the studies at the time that were being done after treatment where people could go to classes. So anyway, by this new delivery format that we designed, I feel like we made it accessible to more people. We made yoga more accessible to more people by keeping it simple and kind of the same every time. So we saw people in the chemotherapy setting for 4. We started out with 3 and we expanded to 4 sessions. And so they met with an instructor while they were getting treatment. And then we had them practice at home, ideally daily. We kind of worked with them on what that looked like and had those few opportunities to check in about how it was going and to go through it again with them. So that was really a different model, or it has been a different model.
Can I show our little stickies? Is that
Yes,
allowed?
that's wonderful.
So those of you that are seeing this on video, which we're getting, all the podcasts are going to go onto YouTube starting May 2nd, 2022. So we'll have a video version as well as an audio version. So these are the little stickies. And as Stephanie was saying just now, we needed to find a way that someone sitting in a chair waiting to get their chemotherapy to make it super efficient could actually get benefit right there. And they wouldn't have to take a lot of extra time. And then once they learned it a few times with the yoga therapist in the setting, they hopefully would do this at home, or at least parts of it. I think we were pretty realistic that they may not do every single thing. And that is, as long as they did something that was helping them, I think we were happy with that. So Stephanie, could you talk just briefly about this idea of, we have an actual protocol and functional reasons why we chose this posture or that breathing technique or this meditation. But because you have very seasoned, advanced yoga teachers and yoga therapists who work for you, they know how to modify the protocol and then mark that down in the research papers to say, hey, today we had to modify this because of XYZ. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because people think, well, yoga therapy can't be protocol driven. It's got to be individualized. And so you're kind of like a little hybrid in between, don't you think?
Yes, I think there's a lot of trade-offs here, right? And so my perspective in writing these grants often, and also as a social psychologist rather than maybe somebody that does like clinical treatment often, is how can we reach, it's kind of the perspective of the most people with this versus maybe the person that's coming to me that really needs it, So it's like this, how do we keep it accessible to do the greatest good for the greatest public health benefit? And so it's just a different perspective, I think, than a lot of clinicians might have or therapists. So all that to say is what we decided to do, and there's kind of a range of this in the research. I think I'm actually our protocols are very almost scripted, whereas there's other people that have a lot more leniency or like flexibility in what people can do. And I think, we did a whole paper on this where it's like, there's kind of a different skill set. You can be a very competent yoga teacher, and, teaching for a research study also requires that you're okay with being video recorded, that you're okay with teaching potentially the same thing, or at least aligned with the protocol each time. And so people that like to be creative or very intuitive and change things up maybe don't want to teach for research. It just depends on the study, I guess. So for us, yes, I'd say for the studies, we have it where we have like very highly trained instructors because we just want it to work as best we can. And by scripting it that way, it could potentially be taught by somebody with a little bit less training because it's very clear what we're doing. So really the modifications we've made are like, if somebody doesn't feel up for the movement, maybe we would not do too many movements that day and keep it more relaxation and breathing focused, or so they're in chemotherapy and usually the ports are fine for arm movements, but sometimes if they have an IV, they don't like to do all of the arm movements, for example. So we do have modifications. I'd say we've kept it pretty simple as far as like just mostly removing things.
Can I just say, knowing when to remove something, that takes some skill. So what I hear you saying is this fine balance between someone who's willing to stick to almost a script and a protocol so that it can be given, if this study works, now we can give it, instead of 7 people or 14 people, now we can give it to hundreds of people. But someone who also is skilled enough to know when to take things out and say, no, that's not going to work for this individual. I mean, that's a very strange balance because most people want to be very creative. They don't want to go on a script, right? And maybe they don't have the knowledge to know when to take things out that are inappropriate,
Yes, it's very important. And when I was able to teach for some studies more, now I mostly write them, but I remember teaching, a 30-year-old person with breast cancer at the time, and she looked fit. I was very close in age at the time. And she was so grateful when I actually listened to her to be sitting in a chair and taking a break. And so I think our tendency to think people want more is very different, especially in this setting where people really want less and they want to relax and they're grateful for the opportunity to do that for themselves. And so, yes, I think it takes, to be very tuned in with people to, to catch that. Maybe somebody's not letting on, they're trying to go, 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 but they really need to back off. And so I think that is important, to have a personal connection.
The other thing I really appreciate about the teachers you've chosen is they understand the importance of relationship, and that relationship is a big part of the healing, that someone is there to say, hey, you're not feeling so energetic today. Why don't we just do breathing? Why don't I just listen to you? And I know you've said this. I think it's so critical that a lot of people going through breast cancer, colorectal cancer, gynecological cancers, they don't want to upset the family and the people around them. And so they have to kind of put on a brave face and rah, rah, and we're going to have a party and hats and balloons for my last day of chemo. But underneath all that, they really love having a yoga teacher that doesn't know any of their family or friends, that can just sit there and be with them. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think we forget the value of relationship.
I mean, that's one of the most rewarding things to me is getting the yoga instructors into that setting. I mean, it's just like bringing a little bit of a healing retreat to them, to people going, the medical setting is not quite as pleasant as being at like a place out in the mountains or something. So it really brings that little sense of peace to people. And connecting with the instructors is probably one of the primary reasons I want them in there. I started losing my train of thought, but I think absolutely.
So just to say, choosing the right instructor in terms of willingness to stick with the protocol, ability to modify, but also having a very nice personality that's caring and nurturing. Like, to find people like that is really difficult. And then you have to decide, do I need to find a local person that's going to see them in person? Or can I do remote delivery over something like an iPad? So talk about remote delivery and why that actually has worked out pretty well in a lot of cases for you and your studies.
So this is another thing that sort of came partially with my relationship with you, Amy, is that after I met you in Nashville, we would meet remotely for my yoga practice. You were in California, or are in California. And so I think the experience of still being able to have a connection with somebody was really helpful. Again, there's so many trade-offs here, and it's like, well, how do we get those really? So part of our studies too, that which you kind of alluded to, is yes, there's these people with very special therapeutic qualities, and they're so dedicated. I mean, the women I've met through, primarily women at this point anyway, that training I mentioned that are dedicated to teaching people with cancer, I mean, we are planning around the patients, at least for these initial studies we were doing in person. So if somebody had an appointment, I mean, and then the time changed or something, like these yoga instructors are really flexible with me and dedicated to the study. And so the advantage of going remote was partially that the instructors didn't have to, maybe block off as much time or show up and then have to go home or wait an hour. And it gave us a little more flexibility for them and their scheduling. And it allows us to have centralized potentially instructors. So if we are teaching remotely, I can have my dedicated instructor I know in Nashville and my dedicated instructor I know in North Carolina, and they can be the people that are working on the study versus getting some people that have a lot of other things going on and just want to help if they can. It's a little less dedication potentially. And so I think, so remote has that quality as well for the instructors. So their other study that you mentioned where we first went remote is delivering yoga around the time of surgery. And so we found that the scheduling of an instructor with the patient before surgery was really challenging sometimes because that window can be short. And so what we found as possible is we give people a video of the yoga practice we're going to ask them to do after surgery. They have a time to talk to the instructor on the phone. And so at least they have a sense of what we're going to ask them to do before they maybe are in discomfort after the procedure. And so then we meet with them again after surgery over a video conference, like, okay, now that we're doing this and you have had your incision, how's it feeling? Let's talk about it. And then we do, again, it's mostly self-directed. They have the video, they can call the instructor if they have questions, but really it's after that, they do it on their own. we proposed to do another study that we added another phone call where we would talk with them again.
Just to be clear, at this point, were they actually learning the study with the yoga instructor prior to surgery, or was it just, here's a video that you're going to start doing after you get home from surgery?
We asked them to do the video before, and then we called to see if they had any questions. So at least they had familiarized themselves with the movements and the breathing before they were uncomfortable potentially.
Right. And so one of the things about remote delivery is, I remember this too. You know, we've been on this 10-year journey together that I've watched how you've done this. And I'm so thankful you're the researcher and I'm the protocol developer because your job is much harder than mine. I remember reaching people in rural areas to get them to do a yoga practice, almost impossible. It's not like you can have a yoga instructor drive out there. So for me, this kind of telehealth where we can reach people all over the world, no matter where they live, and stay connected and hear them and see them in real time through a telephone call or through Zoom or something. The flexibility it adds, as you mentioned, like all of that is so important to reach more people, not just urban dwellers. And like you said, to be able to take a yoga teacher that is seasoned, has good relationship skills, understands the protocol, can modify, take that person from North Carolina and have them teaching somebody in the rural area of, say, Nashville, Tennessee. That's beautiful. And I think that's where medicine is heading. So one of the things I'm so excited about, in addition to the findings about actual cancer that you're studying, is this model of remote delivery or kind of distance medicine, telemedicine, telehealth. So do you have any other things to say about that?
Yeah, I also think it makes it a little simpler sometimes to work in the medical setting. We still do all these trainings about confidentiality. We have the yoga instructors complete. And, you know, especially after we've been through this pandemic, like not having to be there in person is actually helps with some of the barriers that, you know, the badges and all these things that might be a little easier to work with.
And how about confidentiality? I mean, you're mentioning phone calls. I'd imagine, are there some texts? Are there some emails? Like, how do you maintain that? Because I think that's a whole nother area that I was so shocked of how much work you have to put in to make sure that things are HIPAA compliant.
Oh yeah, so it's been evolving. I'd say, yeah, one of the most important things is that video conference is HIPAA compliant. So our medical center has, like, we work with WebEx, for example, which is maybe not as simple as some of the other ones sometimes, but it's just that any of the data from that call is then they have an agreement about who owns it, and it's very complicated. So we just listen to the people that tell us what to do in the med center. We did find it very helpful to be able to text to schedule times to meet with participants. And so we had to then get a medical center device for that to send texts. And one of them was like a flip phone, and that was very clunky. And so, you know, we're working on learning how to do that better. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of options. It's just working through what is secure at your center. And I think everybody has different setups.
And then, you know, another obstacle that I saw you climbing over is that when people are stressed out, it is very difficult for them to use technology. You know, in the terms of yoga and Ayurveda, we would say they have high vata. And when you have high vata, tech doesn't work. The thing doesn't turn on, or you don't think it can turn on. You can't see the button right in front of you that you need to press. You're getting these oral instructions about, well, try this, and it's not computing. So I would imagine when people are in the middle of a cancer diagnosis and treatment that they're pretty stressed out. So how do you overcome that to even get them to use the tech?
Well, yeah, so it gives me a chance to elaborate a little. And so we decided, at least for that initial study, to only, because of my colleague's experience with what you said, to only do the video conferencing part when we were there to facilitate. So the after surgery visit was by video conferencing, because we could have a research person in there, like, here's your yoga instructor. She's on the tablet for you already. We didn't have to have them figure out all the logins and all of it. Is the mic on or muted? You know, that was all figured out for them.
So they're actually in the hospital in recovery from surgery and someone comes in and says, here's your iPad that you're going to take with you, right? Because you gave them an iPad to take home. And here's your yoga instructor. So they did the tech for them right there.
Right. And so the video that they took home on their iPad the iPad was programmed. That's all they could do was press play. So there was no other apps they were able to access. And so it was just, how do we make this as simple as possible, at least for the study? And so what we found, though, was that some people preferred to get a link to the video to put on their own device rather than have the study device. So they had it with them. So we allowed some flexibility and learned over time. And now that people are more savvy with the video conferencing, so for sometimes people would go home from the hospital, not even stay for some of these surgeries. And so then we would do it over the phone. But I think at this point we could do video conferencing at home for some people that they would be comfortable. But our original sort of plan was simple. Yeah.
What I think is interesting about this, especially in the field of yoga, is that the train tracks for how to do research are being laid down as the train is coming at you. So, for example, we think we're studying people who have breast cancer. What are their fatigue levels? How are they sleeping? How are their energy levels? How is their mood? That's like the overall goal. But while you're studying that, you're laying down these train tracks like, oh my gosh, the iPad isn't going to work. And these people don't want to do that. And oh my goodness, my teacher can't stay an hour longer because this client is showing up later. And, to me, that's what I just constantly see you doing, is just finding out how to get those train tracks laid down so that the actual train of breast cancer, gynecological cancer research can go down the tracks. But you're almost doing two things simultaneously because research in the field of yoga and yoga therapy is so brand new.
Yeah, so I'd say a lot of that was because we worked on pilot studies. So hope that's the point. And luckily they fund those so that hopefully by the time that we get to do what they call the efficacy study or the more definitive study where you have enough people in there to say this actually works or not, that we've hopefully ironed out a lot or put down all those tracks to enough of a degree where it's more seamless. So,
for example, I remember very early on, we had some gentle arm movements where you inhale, lift your arm, exhale, cross over your body and touch your opposite shoulder. Inhale, lift your arm, like something that seems so simple. Like, of course, everybody could do that. But when the teachers went to teach it, there's all these cords in the way that are hooked up. There are like the sides of the chair where the armrests were in the way. The shape of the chairs is different than we thought it was going to be. And therefore this isn't possible. So just figuring out how to do arm movements with cords and armrests was like, okay, we got to rethink this, It's so interesting. And this is why I'm not a researcher. I feel like you have the patience of an elephant, honestly.
Well, it's a good thing I have a yoga practice. Yeah. It's helped me. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people don't understand that about research, that there's just going to be obstacle after obstacle. That's part of the journey to figure out how to study this. And I think one of the most interesting things you said today was this idea of where is that balance between creating, say, an individualized yoga practice that's perfect for this human being who has breast cancer, high blood pressure, and knee pain, right? Like that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is kind of just a group yoga class where there's no assessment of anybody in the class. And you just kind of go in and say, these poses seem like they'd be good for breast cancer or breathing exercises. But that place in the middle where you can say, these things are likely to work and we're also willing to modify. I think the reason that's so interesting is because then you can expand that. If it ends up working and your randomized control trial gets published, now you can take that into any hospital in the world and start using that protocol with all breast cancer patients.
Yes. And, what I learned from working from you is that there's sort of a place in between the generic class and the therapeutic, very tailored. There's kind of like more of a targeted, I would say, where it's like, well, we know that the people during treatment are likely to have more vata or pitta or like hot, and so we could still target sort of the issues we thought they might more generally have. And so our goal for our that practice that you mentioned was to feel a sense of peace at the end, potentially, or explore the possibility, we said, of like feeling a sense of peace. Because it was really hard. We didn't want to have a visualization that would resonate with some people and be challenging for others. So we kept it neutral. But to me, that's powerful, to feel a sense of peace amongst that chaos of the chemotherapy setting. And so to have that be our goal it really resonated with what we were trying to do. And I really like, too, that the way that we designed the movements and the breathing, really the movements enhanced the breathing, and the breathing then prepared people to potentially find a sense of peace. And so I feel like it really came together and felt more powerful after we worked together with that framework.
Yeah. I think what you just said is so important. First we were like, oh, we want people to feel peaceful. But the downside of that is if you do this whole practice and you get to the end and the yoga teacher is saying, and now you're going to go into bliss and peace, or whatever they say. Mm-hmm. And you're not feeling that. You're feeling agitated. You're feeling like crying. You feel like screaming. You feel like, why is this happening to me? I have so much fear. I don't have a support. Pointing out that you're supposed to, in quotes, feel really good right now actually can have the opposite effect, because it's pointing out to the yoga student, oh, hell no, I'm not there right now, right? So I loved it that we then changed it. If you're not feeling this, it's totally normal and fine. But could you imagine the possibility that one day you might feel that? Just open a little teeny crack. So that seemed to work a whole lot better.
Yes, I agree. It's really important not to tell people what they should feel. Yeah, to let them
I think
explore.
These are all the micro movements that, in working together for 10 years on these studies, like we just constantly go back and renegotiate and massage it. And okay, we got to do this, that. Like, I don't know if anybody can really imagine a decade of that back and forth with your whole team. I mean, when we get these emails, there are 7 or 8 or 10 people on this team working on this together, which is remarkable.
Yeah, it's been remarkable. I've had very supportive, oncologists involved, and, yoga therapists, and, we have research, like study coordinators, and everybody really is dedicated and works together. Yeah, it wouldn't be possible without everyone.
That's another thing. I think yoga teachers and yoga therapists, they don't understand that even a seasoned researcher like you has an entire team. You have maybe a statistician, and maybe you have somebody that helps you with the review of literature. And then you have the oncologist and the protocol developers. And then you have people like me that check for fidelity to see if the yoga teachers are actually doing what we ask them to do. So there are many times where you will actually videotape the yoga teacher teaching the student. So the camera's on the teacher, not the student. I can hear the student's voice. And then I do a fidelity checklist, and I watch the teacher to see if I feel that teacher is actually building relationship, right? If they are doing the proper cueing for movement and postures. Are they speaking in an articulate way? Are they teaching the breathing the way that we want it taught? Are they doing the meditation? Are they saying, explore the possibility that you could maybe feel some peace, instead of saying you should feel peaceful right now, right? So we have these fidelity checklists that you send me videotapes of the teachers teaching, and I go through and tell you if I think they're actually doing it the way you intended.
So that's a really important component. As you mentioned, we videotape all of them and send you a randomized select few mm-hmm. to be reviewed. And so that enables us to know, so let's say we find that, this program is helping people. So then we can say, or what if we found out that it didn't? It's like, it gives you the knowledge that it wasn't because we didn't teach it correctly, right? It's because we know what we did. We know that if it helps, this is what we did and you can do too. Or if it didn't help, that let's try something different potentially, because this program as written is not the one that was going to help. So I think, just at the beginning where I first started working with people to teach the protocol that were not me, I didn't realize that, for example, they were adding things to what I intended. And I think it was important to have that video and conversation so that we could all get on the same page. Yeah.
Well, and also, if one of your teachers is super charismatic and another one is just kind of a neutral observer, that impacts. So the outcome of the study, it impacts the relationship. So even that, like finding people who are warm and empathetic and caring, but not super like charismatic. And, we have to have a kind of almost a protocol for personality too, to make sure that it's not the personality that's driving the results of this study.
Well, so we do have a caring attention control group that's also helping us control for that for both of these studies. And so the people that are not randomized to yoga are getting somebody that's sitting with them and providing caring attention. So like reflecting back what they're saying and asking how they're doing. And so actually, I believe that by itself is very helpful. And so that we're potentially seeing some signals of differences that the yoga is helping above that is also encouraging. Yeah.
So tell us where you're wanting to take this research. Like as of today, what kind of grants are you going for? Where do you see this going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so the 2 studies we've talked about today, we've submitted grants to potentially do larger versions of them. Both would be remotely delivered as proposed currently. And so that has the advantages that we've discussed, so that if we do find that they're helpful, it would be very feasible for us to scale it up and to deliver the interventions more widely. And so hopefully we'll find out that they're useful. And as I mentioned, we do have a very strong control group. So hopefully, we had to design the next studies to be big enough that we could still see a difference based on the pilot data and what we saw there. So,
okay. So let's just take a minute to talk about your N, your sample size. So for example, you have the control group that's going to get caring, empathetic, active listening. And then you have the yoga teacher / therapist that's going to go in and do the yoga protocol. Like how many people do you need in each group to make it statistically viable?
So it was interesting. The studies that, thought up different ways. So it could vary. It could vary from one that we proposed was 160. And then the other was 400. And so it just depends on what the measure is that you're using and how much it varies between people, and what you saw in the pilot work was how much it varied there in that population. And so that's part of the reason we do the pilot work, is to estimate the larger study. We also use estimates. So people have that develop measures, they kind of decide based on other big studies what level of change would be clinically important or be noticeable. And so
is that what we call the power?
Yeah, so we do the power of the study based on the clinically important difference or the minimally important difference. And then also the variation that you see in the sample. So
it might be statistically significant, but there's no clinical big change that would even be noticeable.
Right. And so what you might see in large studies, maybe not in yoga, but in other types of studies, if you have a large enough sample, you'll often see statistically significant differences that don't really mean much. And so there's importance to have that clinical significance too.
In your wildest dreams, like if everything went beautifully and you got the grants you wanted to get, and a decade from now, you had made the difference you want to make in the world, what would that look like? I didn't tell you I was going to answer it.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I do this to people.
Yeah. We do have to, envision that to convince people to fund the research. When I started, it was more along the lines of having an actual yoga therapist in every treatment setting. Because I think if you were to have an actual person, at least in cities, right, you could see people with all different types of cancer, and that would be feasible. And that's what we were doing in New York City with the Urban Zen program. We would go on the inpatient floors and just see anybody that was there. Mm. And so that would be fabulous. Then you wouldn't have to have such a, schedule, you're only seeing this person on Tuesday at 3:00. We know we have people centralized that were available to do these remote delivery interventions. And so you would have people trained, as we've talked about, that are familiar with this, but they could deliver it at any hospital or in any rural community.
So the nurse could walk in with an iPad to any person in any hospital and say, "Are you ready for your yoga therapy session?"
Yeah.
Or they could have someone on site. I mean, okay, now you have me excited because I feel like, wouldn't that be amazing? And what can we tell physicians that might be listening to this, or even yoga therapists who also want to envision this? What is the thing that yoga therapists are doing that is different from the occupational therapist or the physical therapist or the breathing therapist? Or like, what are we bringing that the hospital would want us? Do you have any thoughts? I have some ideas, but I don't know if you want to
let's go back and forth with this a little. So to me, it's partially what you've alluded to, this presence. And so I feel like there's so much that the hospital or our system now is doing to people that it's really helpful to have somebody in there that is helping support the person in their own healing journey. So we give guidance, and I feel like yoga, the approach is much more empowering. We're giving people something they can do for themselves when there's so much being done to them. And also that sense of potential, exploring the sense of peace in that environment. So of course, there's much more I could get into with, yoga has a combination, for example, for fatigue, where we're doing both some gentle movement along with these more relaxation techniques, for example. I know it can be invigorating as well, but a lot of what we're doing is relaxing. And so that combination is often not in therapies. And that could be, usually you get psychological therapy separate from somatic physical therapy, for example. And it's the combination, I think, is pretty powerful as well.
So I heard you say someone who is offering to hold space and be present, which is missing in our healthcare system, right? So that's a great one. And then
let me just add there, of course, there's psychologists, and there's so few of them, right? So it's another person that is capable of.
It kind of reminds me almost of a hospital chaplain.
I've often thought about working with chaplains. Yes.
And I think we're starting to see a lot of yoga therapists get a dual degree and become hospital chaplains, which is kind of a year-long thing. Maybe I should have one of those on the show, because that's a great thing. I'll have to make a note on that. But also, so in addition to this kind of being there to sit with someone and be present with them, this idea of the relaxation response, it is so stressful to be in the hospital, and to have someone come by and say, hey, would you like to do some relaxation exercises? I'd love to teach you some breathing. I'd love to have you learn how to possibly get closer towards a quiet mind, or, things like that. It sounds so simple, but it's so powerful.
Yeah. People really appreciate that components of themselves are being attended to that maybe are not often integrated in medical care right now.
I think it would take pressure off the hospital staff, because instead of a patient being completely agitated and demanding, they might settle down a little bit. So it's a little easier for the nurses and the doctors. I think it will improve patient satisfaction as a whole, that someone was there to listen to them and to be with them, maybe even if they want to cry, or, just knowing someone's there. I think it will increase the satisfaction of the staff, not only because their jobs would be easier without being attacked by patients, but also they themselves could benefit from the yoga therapist maybe giving staff classes or little techniques that they could use. And I truly believe, and this is where I think the research eventually needs to go. I don't know if you have any intention of this, but I think it can save costs. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, so that the Urban Zen Integrative Therapy program I mentioned, there has been one study, Ben Kliegler, I believe, did, where he explored that. It was more of a comprehensive, it wasn't just yoga. They had some other therapeutic practices, and they also taught the staff some of the yoga. I believe they did see some reduction. I think that's definitely the next step. Yeah.
Because if we can save cost, show client satisfaction, show staff levels of burnout are down, there's no reason this wouldn't be adopted by every hospital.
So the one measure that we have in our current study is length of stay, like how long somebody might stay. And so that's affected by a lot of things, but that's one cost-related measure we included. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell us that we haven't touched on today?
Well, it felt pretty complete.
I
Thank you.
feel like you've given the audience a beautiful overview of the complexity that is required to design it and implement it and get the grants, and how to move step by step over time, and how it can be used in an applied setting. And like you said, through that public health approach, reach the most people and do the most good. So I'm really satisfied with our talk today. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for being here.
Thank you, Amy. It was a pleasure.
I'd like to take just a few moments to kind of wrap up this interview and summarize it, and give you a few additional thoughts. And the first one is regarding this idea of yoga therapy being offered online through remote learning. Some of you know that I've developed the optimal state yoga therapy method with the idea that this could be done through telehealth and telemedicine. We have a focus on mental health, on balancing or regulating the autonomic nervous system through breathing exercises, gentle movement that can be done in the hospital beds, as well as quiet mind meditation type exercises. The whole goal was to make it accessible and practical. And Stephanie mentioned that one of the reasons she chose myself and Optimal State to help her with this was because we can really break it down to practical implementation, which means, as she said, I'm quoted often as saying, the best yoga therapy you can do is the yoga therapy that you actually do. It's really great to have a fancy practice that lasts an hour, but if you never do it, it's not going to help. I would rather have staff members at a hospital as well as clients at a hospital. I would rather have them do 2 minutes of breathing exercises 3 times a day. That will make a tremendous trajectory shift for them in their mental, emotional well-being, and even how their physical body is affected. So that's really something I care deeply about, is making yoga therapy practical so that we can take it into hospitals and clinical settings and actually make a difference in the world. Another thing that has really kind of changed my trajectory of thinking as a result of working with Stephanie in what she's calling remote delivery. I call it telemedicine or telehealth, but she prefers remote delivery. You know, for so long, I was like a lot of others out there that felt yoga therapy has to be in person. You have to have hands-on. You have to be there in person to provide that presence and loving awareness and empathy for people. But working with Stephanie on these studies for the last decade has really shown me that that is actually false. It's not true, that you can develop a very deep relationship with people online. And sometimes because people feel safe in their own home and they don't have to run all over town and get in a car and go up steps and find the room and take a half a day to do all that and then get back home, actually they're more relaxed and sometimes benefit more from being online, especially people who've just had surgery, they have chronic pain, they have chronic illness. Taking a day to come over to you in person just isn't going to work for them, and therefore they're not going to do it, and it's no longer practical, and we don't see the benefits. So I just want to really advocate for this idea that yoga therapy can be done online. It can be taught online, deep relationships can develop, and good things can happen. And I believe that yoga therapists can also be trained online. If they're going to be giving care online, why cannot we be trained online? This may be a little bit controversial. I may get some hate mail for this, but I believe just like medical doctors and physical therapists who are now being trained online, a big portion of the training can happen online, and then you can come in at the end of each year and just do a clinical kind of rotation to see how your bedside manner and your skills are coming along. But that we can actually do about 90% of the training of yoga therapists online. And if there's anyone from IAYT listening out there, please consider this. In our society, there are systemic and structural reasons that people cannot travel so far. It costs a lot of money to get on an airplane and get a hotel room. So by requiring people to actually get trained as a yoga therapist in person, we are actually working against ourselves, and we are only training people that have a lot of money, frankly. I mean, who can pay for tuition and airplane tickets and hotels, wealthy people. And I believe that we want to train people who don't have such a high socioeconomic status. It's pretty easy for us yoga therapy schools to give a tuition scholarship because it's a few more people in the room. It's a whole different story to try to help people pay for their airfare and their hotel rooms and all of that. So I think training yoga therapists can be done primarily online. And I think the care that yoga therapists are giving, as Stephanie is studying and mentioning, can be done through remote learning. And if all the other allied health professionals and allopathic health professionals are doing this, why can't we? That's my question. Why can't we? So that is probably a very controversial thing to say. And I'm okay with it. I'm taking a stand, and I hope that IAYT is listening. All right. Have a great day, everyone. It was so nice to be with you today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Talk soon. Our gift to you is to give you a free infographic each week that you listen to the podcast. If you go to the show notes, you'll see a link where you can sign up and find the categories that you're interested in, like mental health or physical health or social justice. And whenever we have an infographic that is in that category, we'll send it to you weekly. Thank you for listening to our show today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share the episode with a friend or colleague. We're so grateful you're willing to share. Also, you could write us a review on most major platforms that host podcasts. Give us 5 stars if you appreciate the show, and tell us what you love so that we can do more of that. Finally, we support several nonprofit organizations through this podcast. See the show notes to understand how you can help. If you'd like to be a guest or a sponsor for this program, contact us at the email welcome@theoptimalstate.com. welcome@theoptimalstate.com. And finally, a special thank you to our team here at Optimal State. We are truly a global family. George Mantuan, one of our executive producers. Adam Satchel, senior media producer and sound engineer from the Philippines. Krishna Panchal, a producer from Canada. Modupe Abdullahi, who does the show notes and is an editor for us from Nigeria. And Peter Morley, who wrote and produced the music for this show, who lives in Australia. Find more about Peter's work at www.zenmusic.biz. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.